Romans chapter 1, we're going to be reading from verse 18 through 23. And I realise it sort of feels a bit like it artificially stops at that point, but you just keep reading and reading otherwise. So we're dealing with 18 through 23 today. So this is how the Word of God reads. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness, since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God, nor gave thanks to him. But their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like a mortal human being, and birds, and animals, and reptiles. Well, there's a lot in just those few verses, but I've titled the message, Man is Without Excuse. That's the kind of peg we're hanging our thoughts on tonight. And I want to begin with a question, and it's this. Do atheists believe in God? Of course, you know what the answer would be that they would give you, don't you? Here's a better question. Does God believe in atheists? That's the one to make you think, isn't it? Does God believe in atheists? I would venture to say no. I would say no, and that's because of what we read in today's verses. In verse 18, Paul makes a very bold statement, and then he anticipates an objection to it. And here's the statement in verse 18. He says, the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people. Well, that includes everyone, doesn't it? That's all-encompassing. That includes everyone. And that statement explains why we need the gospel, because without Jesus, we would remain under that wrath of God, which is being revealed now and will have its final expression at a time in the future. And that's the bold statement in verse 18. Now, what objection might people raise to that statement? Well, here's a common one. What about people who don't know God exists? What about people who don't know God exists? What about people who have never heard of the Bible? Surely they can't be under God's wrath, can they? Wouldn't that be unfair of God to say that? Well, you see, Paul anticipates that objection in the next few verses, and he gives a summary answer in verse 20. And the summary answer is, actually, people are without excuse. That's his summary answer to that. We'll unpack it a bit, but that's what he says, is people are without excuse. So what that's saying is that all people without Christ are already under the wrath of God, and they're without excuse for their sin against him. They're without excuse for denying him. They're without excuse for that rebellion against him. There's no objection that they can make which holds any water when it comes to dealing with God. Now, I think we all underestimate the importance of these verses in our daily lives, because when you consider our sharing of the gospel, when you consider the way we evangelize, suppose you're having a spiritual conversation with somebody and they say to you, well, I don't believe in God, so none of what you said applies anyway. None of what you've said applies to me. How do we normally, commonly respond when someone says something like that? I just want you to take a few moments to think, how would I respond if someone said to me, well, I don't believe in God? How would you respond to that? What's your normal course of action? It's quite possible that our first course of action is, well, let me try and prove that God exists. That tends to be our first course of action, doesn't it? What have we done at that point? We've taken man's word over God's word. If you think about it, based on what's said here. Because God said man is without excuse. Man says, I've got an excuse. I didn't know. Who's right, man or God? It really comes down, it's that simple, isn't it? It really comes down to that. But we struggle with that because it's not what people like to hear. We find it difficult to hear that. And what we want to do here is unpack these verses. We're going to explain why man is without excuse. And that should help us in our evangelism. We don't have much time to do it, but I'm going to do what I can in the time we've got. So the first reason that man is without excuse for denying God is found actually in verse 18, where we started. God's wrath is revealed, or being revealed. That's present tense, ongoing. That's the gist there. God's wrath is being revealed. Now, what does that mean? Well, that's not speaking of something that we think of as being future, is it? It is revealed. It's being revealed now. It's not speaking of what's to come later, although that certainly is coming. It's not talking about that. God's wrath is being revealed in tangible ways that we can perceive, that we can see and feel. There's consequences for sin. And God's wrath against sin is seen in the effects of the fall, isn't it? The consequences which have come upon mankind because of sin, the curse of death which came upon the world, and especially mankind, of course, when we sinned. We can always see the effects of that curse every day in our everyday life. You don't need to get out of bed before you can start perceiving the effects of that. All manner of things. There are things wrong with our bodies, there are things wrong with our minds, there's things wrong with our hearts, our souls, there's things wrong with the world. You name it, there's something wrong with it. Isn't there? It's all, we're swimming in a sea of problems, aren't we? And we're part of the problem as well. So you can't get away from it. You're just surrounded by it. All this evidence that God is angry with sin is around us all the time. Our problem is we become immune to it. We become so inoculated against it because we're so familiar with these things, we just dismiss them. But actually, God is saying that his wrath is being revealed in that way. We are made aware of the fact that something is not right between us and God by the fact that this is the world we live in. All these things are going on. Now, that doesn't mean to say, of course, I should provide this caveat, that doesn't mean any particular calamity or particular thing that happens to someone is a judgment for their sin in particular. That's not what this is saying. What this is saying is that humanity as a whole experiences these things. The creation has been subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it. See, this is the idea that man has been plunged into this world which is antagonistic towards him now. You know, how many times have you cut yourself while you're gardening? How many times have you grabbed a thorn when you're trimming the roses? Well, now you know why, don't you? This is everything in the creation is resistant to us. It wasn't as easy as it once was. There's something wrong with everything in the world, and we see it everywhere. There's visible, tangible consequences for sin, and those circumstances that we find ourselves in are designed to point out the problem to us. They're designed to remind us God is king, and we've rebelled against him. There's something wrong with the world. So man is without excuse because God's wrath is being revealed. But you can also see why God's wrath is being revealed in this passage as well. And the first and overarching reason is the rejection of the truth of God. Look at verse 18 again. The first reason God's wrath is being revealed is that people are suppressing the truth by their wickedness. Suppressing the truth. Now, to suppress something, you have to have it in the first place, don't you? You can't suppress it if you don't have it already. Humanity can't plead ignorance as an excuse, because what may be known about God, verse 19, it says here, what may be known about God has been made plain to them because God himself has made it plain. That's quite plain, isn't it? The way that's stated, it's very straightforward. It's saying man has got no excuse. He can't say, oh, I didn't know, because God has made it plain to him. Our problem is we say, no, he hasn't. We deny that, and so do people all around the world. They deny that. But again, who is right? Is man right when he says, I don't know? Or is God right when he says, you do know? This is what we're faced with, isn't it? We have to, it's a challenge, even as Christians, this is a challenge, isn't it? Because we're so quick to listen to what someone says and automatically assume they must be telling the truth about that. And we just go with what they say. But actually, you'll find when you talk to people about the gospel, their conscience is on your side. Their conscience is on your side. They know God exists because it's inbuilt, it's hardwired into who we are. I mean, we're made in the image of God. So to know yourself to a degree is to know who God is. You can't escape God in any way because we're made in his image. And this is hardwired into us, we know. And of course, we're aware that the consequences of our sin is death. We're aware that death is not natural. That's why everyone's frightened of it. And rightly so. Because it's not natural. I can't remember who it was that said this to me, but someone said, oh, well, death's just a part of life. It really isn't. It's the end of it. It's not the part of it. Death is not natural. It seems natural to us because that's the fallen world we live in. But death is a consequence of sin. It's not natural. It's an unnatural consequence of sin that's come upon us and creation. And so we need to get to grips with what God says here, don't we? We need to realise that actually God says one thing, we tend to say another. God is the one who's right here. And he says that people suppress the truth by their wickedness or in their unrighteousness, depending which translation you've got. God has designed us, human beings, to have a built-in awareness of his existence. And that's not just saying, oh, I think there's a superpower out there somewhere. We know more than that, because it even goes on to say we know more than that. We know that the one true God exists. We do know that, because there's only one. There is only one God, and that's the God we know exists. We don't think, oh, there's a load of options and I'm just not sure which one it is. This is the way it comes out because we're idolatrous. This is the way it comes out in the way we talk. But actually, deep down, everyone knows that God exists and they know that they're accountable to him. Why is it that you think people don't like talking about religion? In fact, they're quite happy to talk about Buddha till the cows come home, aren't they? But they're not happy to talk about Jesus. What's the difference? When I was at school, we used to have swimming classes. It's one of the few things I enjoyed about junior school. We used to have swimming classes. We had a little pool out the back of the school, and we used to have those little white floats. Does anyone remember those? The square polystyrene, wasn't it polystyrene? Foam board of some kind. And we used to have those. And we used to play a game. It was surf underwater was the game, and we used to get the floats and we would push them down under the water and we would try to stand on them. That's the easy bit. And then we would try to move along under the water while it wasn't on the floor. So you'd have to kind of jump up a little bit, let the float rise, and you try to surf it under the water. I wonder how long we lasted doing that before it popped up to the surface. Almost no time at all. You had to maintain quite a degree of balance and concentration in order for it not just to come shooting up and chin you as it came up from the water. That's an illustration of what people are like with the truth. You see, we suppress the truth, we hold it down, which is what it means, we hold it under, and it takes a conscious effort on our part to suppress it. But as soon as we relax our concentration, the truth comes up to the surface and it gets revealed. The truth comes out, you see. What I mean by that, in practical terms, is that nobody can live consistently and deny God. It's not possible to do. because our inconsistencies reveal our rebellion against God. Now, to really understand how we suppress the truth, it helps to know how God's made it plain. Verse 20 gives you the answer. He says, since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen from what has been made. Wow.
Saw it all today.
Right, that's it. And that's the first way.
Yeah.
It's not the only way. It's the first way. And this is I remember when I first grasped this idea that this text was saying more than it seems to on the surface. I remember being absolutely blown away by this, and it changed forever the way I approach evangelism with people. The plain, obvious way in which things that God is revealed in the creation is the obvious argument we all use. Well, look at the grandeur of creation. Look, it's so majestic. Look at the stars. All of that's true. That's all true. And when people deny that, that is a denial of what is obvious. And they might say, well, it's not obvious, everything evolved out of, it's not obvious. Actually, it is obvious, but it's the suppression of the truth, that's what's going on. It's the suppression of what is obvious, but that's not the only way that the creation reveals who God is. There's other ways as well, which we realise, but they're subconscious. What I mean by that is this. We live in God's world. Right? You can't escape that. This world belongs to God. He created it. We all share the same experience. We all live in that world. And our innate knowledge of God defines who we are as human beings, and it defines how we interact with the rest of the creation. God has set in place laws which govern his creation. Those laws are immaterial. They are universally applicable, and they are unchanging. God has set those things in place. Now, if you're an evolutionist, you believe that everything is just matter, or if you're a materialist, you believe everything's just matter, and it's all going towards chaos and entropy. Reconcile those two things. The Christians will wait. You see, you can say, oh, well, I don't believe in laws, I don't believe all these things, but you can't live like that. Because when you get up in the morning, you don't float up and hit the ceiling, your feet hit the ground, because gravity exists, doesn't it? And you see, someone who doesn't believe in God will say, oh, yeah, but that's just the way it is. Yeah, but if all there is matter, material things, and it's all going in towards chaos, there's no order to anything, no one planned it, no one keeps it sustained as it is, why would you expect anything to be consistent? There's no reason to think anything should be the way it is. This is why Christian scientists found patterns in things. They expected there to be order, and they found it. And see, theoretically, people can stand there and say, oh, well, I don't believe in God. But as soon as they take their next step or their next breath, they act as if he exists. This is partly also what it means by the fact that the creation makes his divine nature known to us, because we live in God's world. It's not just that we see it and think, isn't that beautiful? That is subjective, isn't it? Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. That's a subjective thing. It's true, but it's subjective. Whereas the laws of logic are objective. That's just what it is. They are what they are. You can't get around that. And that's the world we live in. And you cannot escape it, no matter how scientific you are. In fact, the more scientific you are, the more you can see it. You can't escape it. That's the world we live in. You cannot get around that. You can say, oh, well, I don't believe in all this stuff, and then you'll go and act like everybody else as if it's all true. You see, the creation reveals who God is, and we do know he exists, because we live that way all the time. We live as if someone is sustaining the world, someone is sustaining everything in a consistent way. We expect things to be predictable. In fact, that's how science is done, isn't it? The premise that the future will be like the past, that's a basic of science. Well, if you thought the future wasn't going to be like the past, there's no point doing an experiment, because you can't know anything, can you? You see, but we do know things, don't we? That's because we live in God's world. Now, maybe that's a bit, I've skimmed that. I said I'd have to skim it. Maybe that's a bit of a shoot over the head shot. Well, how about this then? Morality. That's something we all know about, isn't it? Morality. You can deny God till you're blue in the face, but when someone steals your car, you get angry. Don't you? I would submit a question to that person. Why are you angry? Just is what it is. It's stuff. It's not immoral. It's not wrong, is it? It's just one person decided they wanted a car. Your car was there. They took it. And you've got no possible objection to that if you don't believe in God, because where do you get objective morality without him? It's just the most you can say is, well, I don't really like this. But that's okay, because they do like it. So it doesn't matter, does it? You see, this is all very silly, isn't it? And the reason it sounds silly is because it is. It is silly. Because we all know these things are true. And that's because the creation reveals that God exists. You see what I mean? This is also second nature to us, that it sounds ridiculous to question it. But people find themselves doing that, because that's what they're forced to. They're forced to say, oh, well, morality is relative, or I don't really believe in logic. In that case, you do. It doesn't really matter. Well, it does matter, because we all live in the same world, and that's God's world. And so the Bible says all people know God exists, and the creation has revealed him to us in such a way that we know he is. That's a challenge, isn't it? So when you next speak to someone that says, I don't believe in God, what they mean is, I don't want to believe in God. The addition of that word is important, because they know God exists, but we can even deceive ourselves into thinking he doesn't. And so when someone says, I don't believe in God, they think they're being genuine. I'm not saying they're lying, I'm saying they think they're being genuine, because we suppress the truth. But as soon as we lose our concentration, we live as if God does exist. There's a saying, isn't there? There's no such thing as an atheist in a foxhole. You know that expression? And that's because all people have this inbuilt desire to find God, or to hedge their bets, or to want to be sure. They want to make sure. When they're in a critical situation, I remember talking to a man who was in this very situation. He'd been a hardened atheist for his whole life, and it came about a week before he died. And he said, well, you know, I've been saying my prayers, but, you know. I said, well, why have you been doing that? What's the point of that? Is that, well, I mean, just in case, like, you know. Just in case. You see, we can laugh at that, but what that shows you is that actually he knows God does exist. Because there's an unwillingness to acknowledge him for who he is. It's still there, that rebellion, but it's coming out, isn't it? The fact that he actually does know God exists, but I don't want to admit it. So this is a challenging passage, isn't it? Particularly if you've never really thought about it like this before. It is a challenging passage. But we have to take what God says over what man says, don't we? Now, verse 21, it just expands a little bit more. It goes a bit further. People refuse to glorify God or give thanks to him. Well, that's assuming they know who he is, isn't it? You have to know him in order to refuse to do those things. It says, for although they knew God, there it is again. Although they knew God, it's a statement, isn't it? A fact, although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. You see, verse 21 is reinforcing that fact that humanity knows God. Now, Romans 1 is primarily talking about pagans. It's talking about non-Jewish people. And in chapter 2, it goes on to talk about the religious Jew and how they've got no excuse because they're just the same. But chapter 1 is addressing the pagans who weren't brought up knowing the Bible. They weren't brought up going to church or synagogue or anything like that. And yet, here it's saying they've got no excuse because they know who God is. They know this God that they're rebelling against. And they refuse to glorify him, and they refuse to give thanks to him. Notice it's refusal. It's not, I didn't give God glory because I didn't know he existed. It's a refusal to give glory. And that's what man is, isn't it? The one who refuses to give God what he is owed. That's our rebellion all over. I won't have this God to rule over me. I'm in charge of my destiny. I'm in charge of my life. I did it my way, to quote someone famous. We don't want God. And so we won't give thanks to him, because if we won't acknowledge him, we certainly won't give thanks to him, will we? And we've also got no excuse, final thing here, because we exchange the glory of God for images of created things. You see, here's the real kicker, is that we think we can get rid of God, but we can't get rid of the fact that we're built to worship something, and that something is God. And so we can't get rid of this tendency that we have to also want to worship. Because our rejection of God doesn't get rid of our identity as worshippers. We're people who worship things. And we're worshipping beings. And if we refuse to worship God, we replace him with other lesser things or unworthy things that ought not to be worshipped. We replace him with other things. We exchange the best thing that we could ever know for a poor substitute which has its origin in the creation. And in fact, I can think of many things which I won't mention now, which actually are worshipping the creation. There are so many things. You've only got to listen to the media today and you will see hundreds of examples of man worshipping created things rather than God. It's all over the place. So many examples, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. It's everywhere. Plenty of examples of man doing that. Obviously, on a basic level, it's the construction of physical idols. It's funny, isn't it? You know, we read in the Old Testament, and it's so easy for us to get judgy, isn't it? We read the Old Testament and think, I can't believe they made a bull out of gold. I mean, what were they doing? What were they thinking? What was Aaron thinking? What are they thinking doing that? And we can get so critical of them. But we do exactly the same thing. People now don't, they're just more sophisticated and convoluted about how we do it. We still have plenty of idols. We worship other things than God. We just might not chisel them out and set them on the mantelpiece. But we still worship all sorts of other things, don't we? Because we're worshipping beings. How many times have you heard someone say the phrase Mother Nature? Just throwing that out there. They may not mean anything by it, but it's an expression that comes from making the creation God, rather than seeing the Creator as God. That's where it comes from, isn't it? There's so many ways that we get all this wrong, isn't there? There's so many ways that people deny God. We refuse to worship him, and yet the Bible says that all of us know that God exists. We all know it exists, and more than just knowing that there's a God, we know the one true God, and we know that we're accountable before him. Those verses reveal why we need the gospel, don't they? Because if this wasn't true, the worst thing you could do is send missionaries anywhere. Think about it. Have a think about that. If this was not true, the worst thing you could do is send missionaries anywhere to tell them the gospel. Because if people were if people had an excuse, when you sent missionaries, they then wouldn't have an excuse. And you'd be actually doing them harm, wouldn't you? But there's a reason we need to propagate the gospel, and that's because people are without excuse before God. We've not thought about it like that, but that's why we evangelize, isn't it? So the root of this text is actually the reason for evangelism. Because if this isn't true, there's no point evangelizing, you don't need to. But because it is true, we must. Because it is true, because people are accountable to God. We must tell them how they can be reconciled to him. And that's, of course, what Paul goes on to do in the rest of Romans. But he lays that foundation there. And we need to realise that that's a foundation we need to understand as well. So when you next talk to someone, and they say to you, well, I don't believe in God, so none of this applies to me. Their conscience is on your side. So when you engage in a conversation with them, they may outwardly disagree with everything you're saying, but inwardly they know you're right. inwardly it will resonate. They know. They can suppress it, but as soon as they take their eye off the ball, it will come popping back up again. Usually later on that day to remind them of the conversation you had. But this should give you real hope, actually, for evangelism, because it tells you that people already know the thing you're going to tell them. Right? You don't have to prove God exists. You do not need to be a scientist to evangelize. You don't, because people already know. That's the bit they already know. All you need to do is tell them how to be reconciled to him, because they already know he's there. That bit's done for you. God has done that bit. Your bit is to explain who Christ is and how they can come to God through him. Talk to them about his life lived for them, his death, his resurrection. Talk to them about that. And then they will come to know God. And they may even join you sitting on the chair next to you in church the next week. And then they may go and in turn do exactly the same thing to someone else a month later. It's important, this stuff, isn't it? There's so many things we could have said about this passage, but we're not going to, because there's too much there. But I would love for you all to go away and read that chapter again in your own time, bearing that in mind. And you will find there's a mine of great material there to help you in your evangelism. And it will give you a real confidence, actually, when you talk to people, knowing that God is the one who set all of this up. He's told them that they exist. You don't have to do that bit. Your job is to tell them how they can be reconciled to him. And that's the good news, isn't it? No good news without the bad news, though, is there? Well, shall we leave it there? We should.